There is a specific kind of empath that almost never gets discussed in the endless online content about sensitivity and intuition. Not the empath who's drained by crowds, not the empath who absorbs everyone's emotions in a room. A rarer, quieter version. The one who discovered, somewhere along the way, that their deepest insight, their sharpest perception, their most accurate read on people and situations actually gets stronger the further they get from other people, not weaker. And today we're talking about exactly that person because if this describes you, you've probably spent years believing something is wrong with you for preferring solitude this intensely, when actually you might be carrying one of the rarest and most misunderstood gifts an empath can have. Let's call this the solitary empath because that's really the most accurate description of what's happening, even though it sounds almost contradictory at first. Empath, culturally, has become associated with constant social attunement. The person who feels everyone's emotions in a crowded room, who can't walk into a party without immediately reading the entire emotional temperature of the space. And that's a real and common pattern. But there's a second, less discussed version. Someone whose empathic gift is just as intense, just as perceptive, just as deeply attuned to human emotion and pattern, but whose nervous system processes all of that far more effectively alone than in the middle of it. Not because they feel less, because they feel so much, so completely, that being in the middle of other people's emotional noise while trying to process their own internal insight becomes almost impossible. Like trying to read fine print while someone shouts directly in your ear. Here's the part that explains why this specific type is called forbidden, and I want to walk through this carefully, because it's the actual thesis of this entire episode. A solitary empath's insight is often more accurate, more penetrating, and more useful than almost anyone else's in the room. And yet, paradoxically, they are usually the last person anyone asks for their opinion, precisely because they weren't in the room contributing constantly the way more externally expressive people were. Society generally rewards visible engagement. It rewards the person who speaks up quickly, who processes out loud, who's constantly present and vocal in group settings. A solitary empath, who does their most important processing away from the group, in silence, often after the fact, gets systematically overlooked, not because their insight is worse, but because it doesn't arrive on the timeline groups are used to rewarding. This creates a genuinely strange and painful dynamic over a lifetime. The solitary empath watches a situation unfold, a family conflict, a workplace dynamic, a friend's relationship slowly falling apart, and often sees, with startling clarity, exactly what's happening and exactly where it's heading, sometimes months before anyone else catches on. But because that insight was processed quietly, alone, later, rather than contributed loudly in the moment, it rarely gets asked for, rarely gets credited, and often, when it finally is shared, gets dismissed simply because it arrives late by social standards, even though it's frequently more accurate than anything said in real time by the people who were actually present and vocal. This is the first reason the gift feels forbidden. It operates on a timeline the world doesn't reward, which means a solitary empath spends much of their life sitting on genuinely valuable insight that nobody actually asked to receive. Here's the second reason, and this one runs deeper, into something more psychologically uncomfortable. Solitude itself, in most cultures, carries a subtle stigma. Preferring to be alone, needing significant time away from people in order to think clearly, choosing depth over constant social contact. All of this gets quietly coded, especially from childhood onward, as something slightly wrong. Antisocial, standoffish. Why don't you want to come to the party? You spend too much time alone, it's not healthy. A solitary empath, especially one who discovered this pattern young, before they had any language to explain it, often absorbed an early corrosive message. The way my mind actually works, needing solitude to process, needing distance to see clearly, is something to apologize for, rather than something to understand and protect. This is exactly why so many solitary empaths spend years, sometimes decades, performing a version of extroversion they don't actually possess, forcing themselves into constant social contact, constant group participation, constant availability. Not because it serves them, but because they were taught, early and often, that the alternative made them strange, difficult, or somehow deficient. And here's the tragic cost of that performance. Every hour spent forcing social engagement that doesn't actually serve their processing style is an hour their deepest insight never actually gets to fully form, because it needs the exact conditions of quiet, distance, solitude, that they were taught to feel guilty about needing in the first place. Let's talk about what actually happens, neurologically and psychologically, inside a solitary empath during time alone. Because this is where the real mechanism of the gift becomes clear. When most people process a social situation, they do it largely in real time, drawing conclusions as the interaction unfolds, adjusting on the fly, responding to each new piece of information almost immediately. A solitary empath's processing works differently, much more like the deep, delayed pattern recognition we've talked about with introverted intuition in other episodes, but taken even further into an almost complete requirement for physical and social distance before the deepest layer of insight can actually surface. During that alone time, a long walk, a quiet evening, hours spent simply existing without another person's energy in the room, something happens that can't happen in the middle of social contact. The noise clears. All the small, half-conscious observations gathered during the actual interaction, a slight change in someone's tone, a detail that didn't quite add up, an inconsistency between what someone said and how they said it, finally get room to surface, connect, and resolve into something coherent. This is why solitary empaths so often report their most important realizations arriving hours, sometimes days, after an event, seemingly out of nowhere, while doing something completely unrelated. Washing dishes, driving alone, lying awake at 2 a.m. It's not out of nowhere. It's the visible result of processing that could only complete itself once the original social noise had fully cleared. This is exactly why forcing a solitary empath into constant social contact doesn't just exhaust them the way it might exhaust an ordinary introvert. It actually degrades the quality of their most valuable trait. Every day spent without adequate solitude is a day their deepest insight never gets to finish forming, which means over time, a solitary empath denied the alone time they need doesn't just feel tired. They start to feel disconnected from their own perceptiveness, confused by their own reactions, less able to trust conclusions that used to arrive with total clarity, simply because the conditions required for that clarity were never actually being met. Now here's why this gift specifically needs to be, in some sense, hidden, or at least protected, rather than freely offered to everyone who happens to be around. A solitary empath's insight, because it's so often accurate, and because it usually arrives without the visible effort of real-time social participation, can come across to people unfamiliar with this pattern as unsettling, even threatening. Sharing an insight that took hours of quiet processing to arrive at, delivered calmly, without the visible struggle everyone else went through to reach their own conclusions, often gets received not as help, but as a kind of unearned, almost eerie authority. How would you even know that you weren't even really part of the conversation? This misreading happens constantly, and it teaches a solitary empath, over time, to keep the deepest layer of their insight to themselves, sharing only the surface-level, socially palatable version, because the full depth of what they actually see is too often met with suspicion rather than gratitude. And there's a second, more specific danger, one that matters enormously for anyone who recognizes this pattern in themselves. Manipulative people, the narcissists, the chronic liars, the people whose entire social strategy depends on controlling how they're perceived in real time, are often specifically unsettled by a solitary empath's presence, precisely because they can sense, correctly, that this particular person isn't fully reading them in the room, in the moment, the way everyone else is. They sense that the real read is happening later, elsewhere, out of their control and out of their view, which means the solitary empath becomes, without ever intending to, one of the hardest people for a manipulator to successfully manage. precisely because so much of their perception happens outside the manipulator's field of influence entirely. This is exactly why so many solitary empaths report a strange, specific experience. Certain people, especially the more manipulative ones, seem instinctively wary of them, even hostile, sometimes from very early in a relationship without any clear provocation. It's not paranoia. It's an accurate, if unconscious, recognition on the manipulator's part that this specific person's insight cannot be fully controlled in real time, because so much of it is happening later, quietly, somewhere the manipulator has no access to at all. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What it actually looks like to stop hiding this gift out of old shame, how to finally give yourself permission to need the solitude your insight actually depends on, and why learning to trust your own delayed, quiet processing style might be one of the most powerful things a solitary empath can ever do, both for their own life and for the people lucky enough to eventually receive the insight that solitude alone was ever going to be able to produce. So let's talk about what it actually looks like to stop hiding this gift. Because for most solitary empaths, the hiding didn't start as a strategy. It started as a wound. And you can't undo a wound-based habit with willpower alone. You have to actually understand where it came from before you can finally set it down. Think back to the earliest version of this pattern in your own life, if this describes you. Somewhere, probably long before you had language for any of it, you likely learned that needing distance, needing quiet, needing time away from the group in order to actually understand what had just happened, got read by the people around you as strange, as rude, as somehow rejecting them. Maybe it was a parent who took your need for solitude personally, treating it as a sign you didn't love them enough, rather than simply a different way of processing the world. Maybe it was a friend group that mistook your quiet observation for judgment, your need to leave early for aloofness, your delayed insight for arrogance once you finally shared it. Whatever the specific origin, the lesson landed the same way for almost every solitary empath. What I actually need in order to think clearly makes other people uncomfortable, so I should probably stop needing it so visibly. This is the exact belief that has to be dismantled, piece by piece, before the gift can be lived openly rather than apologetically. And dismantling it starts with a distinction that sounds simple but changes everything once it's actually internalized. Needing solitude to process is not the same thing as rejecting the people you were just with. This sounds obvious stated plainly, but very few solitary empaths have actually let themselves believe it, because the emotional wiring built in childhood doesn't update just because the logic makes sense on paper. It updates through repeated, lived evidence, moments where you actually take the solitude you need, and the relationship survives it, and sometimes even deepens because of the insight that solitude eventually produces. Here's what this actually looks like in practice, and I want to walk through it concretely because vague permission to honor your needs rarely changes real behavior on its own. The first shift is learning to name the need out loud, rather than either forcing yourself through unwanted social contact or disappearing without explanation, both of which train the people around you to misread what's actually happening. Something as simple as, "I process things better with some quiet time afterward. I'm not upset. I just need to think this through on my own for a bit," said plainly, without over-apologizing, without treating your own nervous system like something that requires an elaborate defense. Most people, when given an honest, calm explanation, adjust far more easily than a solitary empath expects, because most of the friction in these relationships was never actually about the need itself. It was about the confusion created by never naming it clearly. The second shift is learning to trust the delayed insight enough to actually share it later, rather than letting it quietly expire, because the moment it was relevant to has already passed. This is a real loss that happens constantly in the life of an undeveloped solitary empath, genuinely valuable understanding, fully formed, arriving hours or days after a conversation ended, and simply never getting communicated at all, because by the time it's ready, the solitary empath has already concluded, out of old habit, that it's too late or not worth bringing up now. Learning to say, even days later, "Hey, I've been thinking about what you said, and I actually see it a little differently now that I've had time to sit with it." This single habit alone can transform relationships because it finally gives the people who love a solitary empath access to the depth that was always there, just previously locked away behind old shame about its delayed timing. The third shift, and this one requires real discernment, learning to distinguish between people who are simply unfamiliar with this processing style and people who are actively threatened by it. Not everyone who seems confused by your need for solitude is being malicious. Many people have simply never encountered this pattern before and genuinely don't understand it yet, which means patient, calm explanation often works beautifully with them. But some people, and this circles back to what we talked about in the first half, the manipulators who are specifically unsettled by insight they can't control in real time, will actively push back against your solitude, framing it as coldness, as punishment, as evidence you don't care, specifically because your distance removes them from a dynamic they need to control. Learning to tell these two categories of people apart is crucial, because the correct response to genuine confusion is patient explanation, but the correct response to someone actively trying to guilt you out of a need, is real, is simply holding the boundary anyway, regardless of how uncomfortable their reaction makes you feel in the moment. I want to say something important here, because this entire conversation could easily be misread as an argument for total isolation, and that's not what a healthy version of this gift actually looks like. The goal was never to disappear from human connection entirely. Solitude, for a solitary empath, was never meant to be a replacement for relationship, only the necessary condition that allows genuine connection to actually be possible afterward. A solitary empath who learns to honor this need properly doesn't become more distant from the people they love. Paradoxically, they usually become more present, more available, more genuinely engaged during the time they do spend with others, precisely because they're no longer operating on a depleted, overextended nervous system that was never given the recovery time it actually required. There's something else worth saying honestly, because I don't want to leave this conversation sounding like solitude alone automatically produces wisdom. It doesn't. Solitude produces clarity only when it's actually used for reflection, rather than simply used to escape or numb out. There's a real difference between solitude that processes, sitting with what happened, letting the pieces connect, allowing genuine insight to surface, and isolation that avoids, filling the alone time with distractions specifically to prevent any real reflection from happening at all. A solitary empath living this gift well isn't just alone often. They're alone in a way that's actively, quietly working, turning experience into understanding, turning observation into wisdom, rather than simply hiding from the discomfort of connection altogether. And this is the final, most important piece, the one I want to leave you with today. The gift was never actually meant to be hidden out of shame. It only ever felt that way because the world you learned it in didn't have the patience for a timeline slower than its own. But slow doesn't mean wrong. It means thorough. And thorough, quiet, deeply processed insight, the kind that only solitude can actually produce, has always been rarer and often more valuable than the fast, loud, immediate reactions the world tends to reward instead. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've talked about today better than any explanation could. Picture a photograph developing in a darkroom, not the instant kind, the old kind. The kind that requires total darkness, patience, and time before anything becomes visible at all. In the beginning, there's nothing. Just blank paper, submerged in liquid, sitting in complete stillness, giving no indication at all that anything meaningful is happening beneath the surface. Someone unfamiliar with the process, watching only the first few seconds, might reasonably assume nothing is going to appear at all, that the paper is simply empty, that the process has failed, that there was never actually an image there to begin with. But give it time, in that exact darkness, and something begins to happen that couldn't happen anywhere else under any faster or brighter conditions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, shapes begin to surface. Details sharpen. What was invisible just moments before begins revealing itself, layer by layer, until finally, a complete, unmistakably clear image emerges. One that was there the entire time, latent, waiting, but that could only actually become visible through exactly the conditions that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening at all. That is what solitude does for the mind of a solitary empath. It isn't absence, it isn't avoidance, it isn't the empty, unproductive silence it's so often mistaken for by people who've never needed anything like it themselves. It's the dark room every deep insight has to pass through before it can become visible at all. And the world's impatience with that darkness was never proof that nothing valuable was forming inside it. It was only ever proof that the world was looking at the wrong moment, expecting the picture to already be finished, when the truth, the whole time, was quietly, patiently, developing exactly the way it always needed to.